My Lords, my noble friend Baroness Jones of Moulsecoomb has already set out the temporal position of this bill. It's at the end of a long line of debates through the Agriculture and Fisheries Acts, the Trade Act, Brexit. It's the place where the government told us many of the issues raised in those debates would finally be dealt with. It's the place, it would seem also, where the Dasgupta Review call for new economic indicators should be acknowledged, as the noble Lord Bellimorio is referring to. It's the place to start the transformation from an economy based on the exploitation of people and environment to a system based on resilience and regeneration. Now, this is 25 years after the Act that set up the Environment Agency. This bill is certainly urgently needed, for that Act clearly failed. 25 years of governments of various hues clearly failed. Our nation ranks 187th among the global scale for the state of our nature. Much of it is a beautiful but sterile green desert, from the burned, shorn land of our first national park in the Peak District to the rapeseed flowers now blanketing chemical-drenched fields. And yet food security remains an acute and pressing issue. Unlike the noble Lord Cameron, I won't posit a Third World War, but rather point to our responsibility as a wealthy nation not to take food and water, labour and resources from the fields and mouths of others in a world where production is threatened by the climate emergency, the water crisis, the destruction of soils, and the massive practice of food waste that is factory farming of animals. Now, many noble lords have already addressed issues that the Green Group, all two of us, will be seeking to offer our support on. I endorse many things that the noble Lady Baroness Parmenter so eloquently said, including the need for environmental principles to be applied universally, the need for local governments to have the resources they need to protect and enhance nature, the principle of net biodiversity gain, not excluding major infrastructure developments. In fact, I'll go further and say we need to abolish the principle of biodiversity offsetting. We have so little left that we can't afford to destroy any national treasure we have left, certainly not for the uncertain outcome of a few saplings stuck in a field and called a replacement for an ancient forest. Relatedly, the Secretary of State should not be allowed to amend the habitat regulations at will. The noble Lord Montrose spoke of a forest of Henry VIII regulation. This is one forest that should be felled. Other noble lords, the noble Lord Khan and the noble Lord Ruruka, focus particularly on the legal weakness, indeed the legal attack on basic principles contained within this bill, as so powerfully outlined by the Bingham Centre. We'll be working on that. And the noble Lady Baroness Boycott, not currently in a place, I would agree with everything she said, and thank her for drawing attention to the NEP planning issue. Drawing from that a broader point, I would say that the government in its planning and agriculture principles seems to be locked into a sparing rather than sharing mindset. Spare a little land, make it pristine and rich, and trash the rest for industrial agriculture or housing luxury development of a kind that fails to meet urgent community needs. We need to care for all of our land. And the noble Lord Trees pointed out an obvious gaping hole in the bill, the lack of measures on antimicrobial resistance. Now, I don't often quote David Cameron, but I will today. With some 250,000 people a year already dying from infections resistant to antibiotic drugs in Europe alone, this is not some distant threat, but something happening right now, end quote. That was in 2014. The noble Lord Teverson rightly stressed the importance of our marine environment and the non-existence of its protection. These are all issues and more on which the Green Group intend to offer support. Now, I'm afraid the rest of my speech is also in the nature of a list, issues that I haven't heard other noble lords clearly set out. That reflects concerns that my noble friend and I have heard from the millions of voters we do our best to represent, and the many industry and campaign groups whose issues are not covered or badly dealt with in existing issues of the bill. The ordering is roughly in the order of the easiest issues, from the ones that any sensible government would surely embrace, through to the ones that require a fundamental philosophical shift. that require an understanding that there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life, for the natural environment to be cared for, if we just share those resources out fairly. This requires a sudden outbreak of understanding of planetary limits. I live in hope. First, plastic and packaging materials. An amendment to ensure the bottle deposit scheme is variable, reflecting the size and impact of bottles, not just their number. And an amendment to tackle the horrendous, costly waste of disposable nappies, both to household budgets and the cost we all bear in council waste. But what's really lacking in this bill is an understanding of the waste pyramid. Recycling is third best. We have to reduce and reuse, and recycling a poor third. Secondly, pesticides. We've soaked the planet with poison. We need to protect rural dwellers from pesticide applications. We need to protect the whole of our land from pesticide applications. Briefly, because I'm running out of time, human rights have to be linked to environmental rights, due diligence along the lines of the Bribery Act, and the issue of what land is for, partially raised by the noble lady Baroness Young of Scone. It has to be for the people and for the natural world. Driven grouse shooting, growing food to waste in feeding to animals kept in misery, sugar beet production, stripping soils and producing obesity. These are some examples of land uses we don't need. And a final point. We hear often in our Lordship's house that these are crowded islands. Well, the crowding has one very large cause. 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the people. 99% of people are excluded from half of our land. An environment bill surely has to offer access to more of it, a great deal more, for food growing, for nature, for recreation. Land, they're not making any more of it, so we have to share it out fairly.